Good morning and thank you for joining us today for our 2020 Remembrance Day program. Each year, we take some time to acknowledge those people who have made sacrifices so that we may enjoy the freedoms that we have today. Some of those people are former Central Collegiate students, and we will speak about a few of these students later. Now I would like to introduce our MCs for today, Emily Tower and Austin Lind.
As we gather here today, we acknowledge we are in Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We recognize that in the course of your studies, you will spend time learning in other traditional territories and Métis homelands. We wish you safe, productive, and respectful encounters in these places.
Alors que nous réunissons ici aujourd'hui, nous reconnaissons que nous sommes sur le terrain du traité 4, les terres traditionnelles des peuples Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Dakota, et Lakota.
Today we share the message of peace and remembrance of our veterans. Many of these veterans were from Moose Jaw and Central Collegiate. Please rise for the singing of O Canada by Madeline Eros.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Please be seated. 104 Central Collegiate students were killed in the Great Wars. Today we will take a moment to honor a few of them.
Nous demandons à Alana Gooding de nous raconter l'histoire du privé G. Sinclair et Riley Bickford va nous discuter de l'officier de vol Richard Gainford Askew.
Private G. Sinclair was the son of William Alexander and Maud E. Sinclair. He was born in Truck, Saskatchewan. He was 16 years old when he joined the Army, which was very young. Sinclair was a member of the 46th Battalion from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. These World War I battalions were known as the Suicide Battalions. He was killed on March 26, 1917. He was buried in the Villers Station Cemetery.
Flying Officer Richard Askew Gainford served in the Royal Canadian Air Force's 69th Squadron. He was born on the 25th of July 1944 to Edward and Mary Agnes Askew. They lived on 511th Ominica Street East. Richard died at the age of 21 and is buried at the Bayeux War Cemetery.
Merci Alana et Riley. Deux étudiants vont réciter le poème au chant d'honneur en anglais et en français.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, the scarce heard amid the guns below.
Nous sommes morts, nous qui songions la veille encore, à nos parents, à nos amis, c'est nous qui les posons ici, au champ d'honneur.
Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
We will now ask Gabrielle Oni to tell us about Rifleman John Hillard Noel Butler and Lexi Trelevin to talk about leading aircraftman Archibald Graham.
John Hilliard Noel was a former Central student who served in the Regina Rifle Regiment. He was the son of William Hilliard and Elizabeth Butler, who lived at 1142 Alder Avenue, northeast Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and was married to Olive Butler of Moose Jaw. He passed away at the age of 35 on August 8, 1942. John Hilliard was buried at the Benny-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery.
Graham Archibald was a soldier in the war who attended Central Collegiate. He was the R-203-982 leading aircraftsman for the Royal Canadian Air Force. He lived on 221 Hochelaga Street East in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. He passed away at age 22 on May 21st, 1945. He was buried in Moose Jaw at the Rosedale Cemetery.
Please stand. Ava Albright will now play the last post. Following the last post, there will be a moment of silence in honor of those who gave their lives for our freedom. I also ask you give honor to the former Central students who gave their lives for our freedom during the Great Wars. Please remain standing until Ava has played Reveille.
Merci Eva. Monsieur Rawlick et Monsieur McCorriston ont préparé une vidéo de l'histoire des Forces armées canadiennes.
The Canadian Armed Forces have been operating since 1867, the year Canada became a country. They were responsible for our defense because the last British garrisons had left. The first major engagement was actually here in Saskatchewan. The Métis people from the Batoche area had rebelled against the local law enforcement in what was to become known as the Northwest Resistance of 1885. The Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, sent a battalion of troops from the east under the leadership of General Middleton to quell the uprising. The problem was the CP railway that was transporting them was only partially completed, and they had to walk hundreds of miles in the winter to get to the next functioning railway sections. Moose Jaw actually served as one of the bases for the army, and many of the troops marched right over the grounds of Central Collegiate on their way up to Batoche near Prince Albert. I want all you students to imagine walking from here to Prince Albert and then engaging in a battle. The Métis had their own commander, Gabriel Dumont, who is remembered as a military genius. The ill-equipped and outnumbered Métis defeated the Canadian forces at the Battle of Fish Creek. However, Middleton and his battalion eventually reached Batoche, and with the help of a Gatling gun, they crushed the remaining resistance. The Métis political leader Louis Riel was hung for high treason. The next major conflict involving the Canadian Armed Forces was a little-known expedition called the Boer War. The war lasted from 1899 to 1902. Canada sent 7,000 troops to South Africa to defend British interests. In those days, Canada was little more than a British colony, so when they said fight, we had no choice. We would see this happen again in World War I.
So World War I, 61,000 Canadians dead, 172,000 wounded. That's like the entire population of Regina. So World War I was from 1914 to 1918. This war was especially brutal. Most of the Canadians fought along what was called the Western Front. It was a series of static trenches from the coasts of northern France to Switzerland. And no side really won ground. There was lousy generals. They kept sending thousands and thousands of troops over their trenches, across barbed wire, no man's land, mud, dead bodies to try and take over the enemy trenches. Canada's general was Arthur Currie. He was arguably the best general in the entire war simply because he wanted to save the lives of his troops. He trained Canadian soldiers to reach objectives rather than simply sending them to their deaths. And Vimy Ridge is an example of this. It's Canada's war memorial, and the land in France is actually ceded to us. The trenches were brutal. You had rats the size of cats because of all the dead bodies. You had trench foot, lice, constant bombing, poisonous gas. Canada's contribution to World War I made the world aware of us. We really punched above our weight here. We became a country in the eyes of the world because of World War I. I get the feeling that many young people are not aware of this war because there's not many Hollywood films depicting it. Well, that's because the US wasn't involved in it until the last year. The World War I films tend to be British, Canadian, or Australian. This war was especially brutal because weapons were quite primitive by modern standards. They often just wounded you instead of quickly killing you, and you saw the faces of who you were trying to kill. Imagine living with that. And there wasn't PTSD yet, so there was little or no help if you survived the war, and you had to live with the horrors that you witnessed. And if you survived, you were sent back home and told, well, to be normal again. But once you returned home, you had to face a pandemic way worse than COVID. It was called the Spanish flu. Maybe you heard of it. It killed 20 million people, more than the entire war. If you look at pictures, you'll see some very familiar sights. People wearing masks, some people arguing about wearing them, stores closing. History is a circle. Just another piece of information. A Moose Jaw boy, George Price, was the last British Empire soldier to die in World War I.
In 1936, Spain elected a Republican government. The Spanish general Francisco Franco did not like this government, and he organized a military takeover. He had the backing of Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, and they supplied him with modern weaponry. Eventually, this turned into the Spanish Civil War, and many historians consider this the prelude to World War II. There was a strong feeling around the world that people should help the Republicans in their fight against fascism, but the Canadian government decided not to send aid. Therefore, 1,546 Canadians went on their own to fight the fascists in what was called the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion. They fought in Spain for 2 years, outnumbered, outgunned, and almost half of them died. Franco and the fascists won the Civil War and would join Hitler in World War II.
So World War II, well, 1939, arguably 1937 to 1945. You had 45,000 Canadians dead, 55,000 wounded. But that's 3 Moose Jaws. Unlike World War I, the Germans successfully took over all of Europe, leaving Britain all alone on the Western Front. And the U.S. wasn't involved in the war yet, and they bet that Britain would fall, and they didn't, in large part to Canada. We sent convoys of food, supplies to Britain, even though many ships were destroyed by Nazi subs. This was called the Battle of the Atlantic. We also had pilots who helped to barely save Britain from Nazi invasion, and that was called the Battle of Britain. This happened all before the U.S. was involved. Russia was battling Nazi Germany for years before the Western Allies finally decided to invade Europe with what we know as D-Day. Canada's job was to secure Juno Beach, and we did that. One note was that before Juno, the Allied countries needed to test the German defenses, so they attempted a test raid. The Canadians attempted to take Dieppe. It was a French resort town, an utter failure. And of the 5,000 Canadians there, 3,400 casualties. Canadians also valiantly tried to defend Hong Kong against an overwhelming Japanese force. We were a significant force in the Sicily and Italy campaigns, where we succeeded in all of our objectives. 6,000 Canadians died there. We were also involved in the Korean War, 1950 to 53. We had 26,000 troops with the UN. 516 Canadians died. One battle of note is called the Battle of Capion, were an incredible example of Canadian and Australian courage against overwhelming odds. 20 to 40,000 Canadians also enlisted with the U.S. for the Vietnam War in 73. And many Americans at that same time tried to dodge the draft by coming to Canada. 134 Canadians died serving with U.S. forces. Maybe here's something that you might want to do. Make sure that you look at the World War plaques. They're above the church bench at the top of the stairs at our school, the south entrance. It lists all the men from Central who died in the wars, the Great War and World War II. Take a picture of them, and each Remembrance Day, try to remember for a moment or two one of them.
Since 2001, Canadians have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and many other nations around the world. There are Canadian soldiers deployed today who put their lives in danger and often make the ultimate sacrifice, defending Canadian interests and freedoms.
Thank you, Mr. Rollick and Mr. McCorriston. We ask that you please rise for the playing of God Save the Queen by some of our Central Band students.
Vous pourriez vous asseoir. Monsieur Holmes fera les remarques finales.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you continue to be thankful for all the privileges we enjoy.